Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Brent Hendrich, who is a freelance engineer based out of Nashville, who has been in the industry for over 20 years. He's worked on a Dove Award-winning record. He's also made contributions towards Emmy Award-winning compositions. And he's worked on a ton of great music in a variety of genres, including rock, pop, EDM, soul, jazz, singer-songwriters, you name it. And in this episode, we cover a lot of ground. We get into how to break into freelancing as an engineer and some of the traps that you want to avoid when you're getting started, and how to focus your energy on the right areas so that you can get clientele and actually make a living off of this and survive those early stages when things are rough and you're trying to figure out what to do or who to contact. We cover all of that stuff, and Brent shares some great tips on how to break into the industry. And we also get into a really cool chat about how limitations can help foster your creativity, and they can actually make you a stronger, better engineer. And again, Brent shares some great tips on some exercises that you can do to help strengthen your engineering skills and to put things to the test so that you can optimize your processes and work more efficiently. So with all that said, I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. There's a lot of great stuff to take from it and some really actionable stuff to do as well. So let's just jump right into it. Brent Hendrich, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. What's going on, man?
Not much. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you or the work you're doing these days, can you give us that story on your background, how you got into music production and ultimately mixing these days?
Sure, yeah. It started, my love for music started at a very, very early age, just 2 or 3, 4 years old. I loved listening to my parents' music collection. I had, a collection of my own and just always wanted to listen and dance. And so that's kind of where it first started. Later on, maybe 12 years old or something, I got my first guitar. It was a gift from my grandparents. And I just started learning just some basic power chords and started, jamming with friends at school. And then that led to playing with bands in high school and playing some at church. And then, from there, forming a band, we started, recording our first EP in high school. And, it was kind of when I first fell in love with the whole studio experience. That was, I guess, in the late 90s, and we worked at a studio that had just a very basic Pro Tools rig. And I thought, this is the coolest thing, that we can write these songs and record them on this computer and then burn it to a CD and share it with my friends later that day. And so when it came time to do our second album, I had saved up some money from my job and had just a very basic PC and bought just a really cheap 8-input interface. And we, set up a studio in my parents' basement, and we started just, recording some of our ideas there. We had a little Mackie mixer that we used for our preamps, so we borrowed some mics from the church, and it was just a very basic setup. But, over the process of a year or something like that, we started recording our full-length album. And that's when the bug really bit me. That would have been, I guess, probably 98 or 99. And that's when I was like, okay, this is like, I'm really passionate about this, and this is not just, playing in a band. That's cool and all, but I don't really want to be in the spotlight. I like this behind the scenes, creating something and taking as much time as I need to make this product to then share with others and entertain others. And so from there, I was like, okay, forget this band thing. I want to look into school for audio. And so I, looked at Belmont here in Nashville. I grew up in East Tennessee. I forgot to mention that. So it's about 4.5 hours here from Nashville. And so yeah, I was looking at maybe some options in Nashville. It was a music hub, but it wasn't super, super far from home like LA or New York. And there was a few options. There was MTSU, which still has a good program, and Belmont, which is another good program. And then the school SAE had just opened up down on Music Row, which was like a 9-month program. And some mentors had advised me that, hey, you don't necessarily need a 4 or 5 year degree to do this music thing. It's more about who you know, what you can do. And so they convinced my parents that college wasn't absolutely necessary, and came down and toured SAE and and thought, this is going to be a good option. So in 2000, just right out of high school, I graduated in 2000. So I moved to Nashville when I was 18, and got an apartment with a buddy, and we went to, he was actually a friend of mine that was also in the band that I was in, and he wanted to pursue audio as well. And so we did the 9-month program there at SAE and had an apartment just outside of town. And yeah, so after finishing SAE, still was madly in love with, making records or recording music and the whole process. And, started doing some internships. I was working at Starbucks part-time while at SAE and met a guy who was a big composer for television. And then that led to an internship. And so I got to, work a lot with him on the music that he was doing for daytime television, whether it was engineering some strings or his piano or tuning some vocals, working in a secondary studio, like his B room, doing overdubs. It kept me pretty busy. And then from there, I, was still working at Starbucks part-time and then met another mentor of mine, which led me to, start making records with him. And that was more like rock stuff in the Christian side of things. And so that was a really exciting time because we were working on major label stuff. And he was one of my favorite producers in high school. So it was really cool to be working with, for him. And that led to, me helping him with a record that won a Dove Award, which was exciting. It's kind of like a Christian Grammy for anyone who doesn't know what that is. And and then I guess it was around 2002 or 3 that second, I guess working with Pete was it kind of the working with Brian on the film and TV side of things. That was more, I guess, of an internship. And then when I switched over to working with Pete Stewart on the major label rock stuff, that became more of an assistant position where I was getting paid a little bit, and it was more of a full-time job. And he, I guess, around 2002 or 2003, decided to move to California. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm on my own now, and I'm going to have to do this thing on my own. And so, ever since then, I've been, just a freelance producer and engineer. So that's kind of and I've been here in Nashville the whole time. So this is my 23rd year, and I guess about my 20th year of doing this all professionally. So
that's amazing, man. There was one little bit of that story that I think is like that stood out to me, and that was how you met someone while working at Starbucks that really seemed to kind of create the snowball effect moving forward. And I think that's such a really interesting part of your story, because it really goes to show the fact that networking can happen anywhere.
Yep, absolutely.
And you just have to be ready for it.
There's actually, it gets even crazier. So yeah, he came in to Starbucks while I was working. And this was when I was still at SAE. He had a BMI hat on. I said, "Oh, do you write for BMI?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm a composer." And he just saw how passionate I was. I was like, "Oh, what do you do? How do you record that? What's your studio like?" And just from that short little interaction, he knew that I loved what I was doing. And he was like, "Let me take you out to lunch in a few days." And so we met up, and that's kind of how it all started, was just from wearing a BMI hat. But then the crazy thing is, many years later, maybe my 4th or 5th intern was, he was, my intern was, his parents were friends with this guy who had met at Starbucks. And so Eric, became an intern at the time because of Brian. He connected us, and then I got to know Eric's family and his sister, and who is now my wife. So I met my wife from that interaction at Starbucks, which is pretty crazy.
That's amazing.
It's this chain of events, and Eric, I'm still great friends with him too. So yeah, it's you never know what might happen just by asking someone about the hat they're wearing.
I love that story, man. Like, it's such a small thing that created such an amazing snowball for you. And I think that, people listening to this, it's like, sometimes you just got to take that chance and talk to someone and, find that little thing that gets the conversation started, and who knows where it leads. And, there's definitely that saying, what is it? Like, luck is when opportunity and preparation meet, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
And I think that, that's a perfect example of it right there. It's like, you're ready for it. You capitalize on that opportunity to just, chat with someone and show how eager you were. And there you go. Right.
Yeah. I mean, and the same thing, while I was working with Brian, I mentioned that Pete Stewart was the next guy that I started working for. That was just someone coming into Starbucks as well, and me talking with them and them saying, "Oh, who's your favorite producer right now?" And I said, "Pete Stewart." And he's like, "Oh, we're good friends. Why don't you, here's his phone number. Why don't you call him?" And then just called him the next day, and that opened up, that door as well. So yeah, you gotta, just be out there and talk to people, and you never know what kind of doors may open.
I love that. That's very cool. Another part of what your story there was that you were working for these guys and you were assisting or interning, and then eventually you got to that point where your mentor moved away and you kind of were faced with that decision to go freelance. Had you been freelancing at all before that? Like, did you already have a clientele of your own at that point, or were you just like, okay, like this is what I'm meant to do, I'm just going to figure it out from here?
Yeah, that was a scary time. And I know a lot of people, making that jump is hard. And I was doing some projects on the side as well that just, word of mouth, some stuff came through. And so I had a few clients before 2003 when I went freelance. So there was a little bit of work kind of coming here and there, but it was pretty dry there those first few years. Those were definitely some of probably the scariest years of my career, just trying to build that, clientele. And that's, I think, the hardest part. One of the biggest challenges in this industry is, making that transition from working, under someone to then, deciding, okay, I want to be the boss now. How do I make that happen? And so there's, we can maybe talk about some of those things too, if you want, as to what, I feel like when you're ready to make that transition, some of the things that I feel like are some of the things you need to be focusing on.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that because I think that there's a lot of people that are in that position, and
it's
like the typical thing that like I've noticed with so many people that I know that have started their own businesses. It's like, they might be working for someone and then they're thinking like, oh, this is easy. Like they just do this part of it. And like, I could totally do that better or whatever, and then they finally go on their own and they realize, okay, it's not just that like, it's not just working on audio. Now it's like, I got to run a business. I have to learn how to market myself and promote and like all this other stuff that comes along with it. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that transition for you of getting into freelancing and learning how to get your clientele and build that business.
Yeah, it's something that, I talk with interns about, because this is something that comes up a lot with them. It's like, okay, I've got one more year left of school. Like, what do I do next? And I tell everyone, those first few years are typically going to be pretty hard unless you work on just something and it blows up right away. But for a lot of people, it doesn't happen like that. It's a slow compounding effect. That's the word I like to use, is compounding, because that's really what it's been for me. Is just, you start by hustling really hard and trying to get a few good clients, and you just, take such great care of them, and they stick around. And then, the following year you get a few more, and then you treat them really great, and then they stick around. And next thing you know, okay, after a couple of years, you have 10 clients, and then they come back for their second and third project. And so it just starts to build and build and build over time. So, there's a lot of hustling. There's a lot of great customer service involved. There's a lot of, marketing, like you said, keeping a website up to date, sending out some type of, production or engineering reels that kind of show what you're, capable of doing, networking, like you talked about, getting out there and going, especially if you're in a town like Nashville or LA, where there's a lot of events, whether it's open mic nights or, let's all get together and critique songs, or songwriting camps. Another thing is just keeping up with social media. What are some of the other things that are really helpful? That's just a few that kind of come to mind that you can really focus on. I know now there's things too, like Sound Better and all that too, where you can put yourself out there as well, and maybe bring in a little bit of a side income stream as well. So
no, those are all great tips there.
Yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a lot of little things kind of slowly coming together over time. At least it was for me. So.
Absolutely. Looking back at it, do you feel like I feel like I went through this with my own experience, and I'm curious if you did as well. But do you feel like when you first got into it, there were a lot of things that maybe kept you busy, but weren't necessarily contributing to like you getting clientele? Like I a classic example is like a lot of people say, like when they start off a business, a lot of people will get business cards and stuff like that. But business cards itself don't really bring in clients. It's like there's so many other things that are more important. Do you feel like you ever found yourself in a trap like that?
I think so. Yeah, you don't really know where to start. I feel like in those early years, you're like, oh, okay, I've got to market myself. Let me do, like you said, let me print coffee mugs and let me get business cards and let me spend way too much time on this website that only 5 people will look at a day. Those things don't really like move the needle as much. So yeah, now that looking back on it, I think instead of taking that money and buying business cards, you'd be better off, setting a goal of once a week, I'm going to take, a producer or an engineer out to coffee and spend that, $5 a week on someone and just start to build relationships. Or, going to a show and paying, a cover to get in a show once a week and introducing yourself to members of the band. I feel like that's almost a better investment than, spending a bunch of money on stuff that no one really cares about.
For sure. Yeah. I think the other big one that a lot of people fall into is like social media, and it's like, well, social media is what all these big brands do. So if I'm just on social media posting stuff every day, then people are going to come my way. And it's like, well, no, not really. Because when you're starting, you have nobody following you. And,
right.
You can spend all that time marketing on there. But like, if no one's listening, then.
Sure. Yeah. You can try to find ways, I guess, on social media to show off some of your skills and your talents to maybe start to slowly, get other people's attention. That might not be a bad thing if you're, do something really, you get some crazy cool drum sounds that no one else does. Maybe you can make reels showing how you do that. And then maybe that'll, next thing you know, it gets 200,000 views and maybe some work could come in from that potentially. But yeah, you're totally right. I think that's, something that just doesn't always get the job done.
For sure. Yeah. There's definitely much more of a proper strategy involved in growing your business and getting started with this. And, not just feeling like you need to do everything because that's what a professional, quote unquote, professional business does. It's like, there's ways to just get started and find the right people and, get those people through the door.
I think social media is good too for once you kind of have some momentum. I think just more of the interacting with others, the networking, getting together to meet people and get to know people and in the scene where you're at is probably better. I think social media is really good for just reminding people that you exist and you're out there still doing your thing and kind of that front of mind aspect as opposed to bringing in work. But it could also, like you said, it could be, or like I said, it could be a good way to show off what you are. If you worked on a really great project, you could put together some little snippet to show that you mixed that and someone may hear that and be like, oh, wow, that sounds great. Let's talk about maybe mixing my record as well. So yeah, I think you just kind of need to have your hands in a lot of different things, but yeah, like making the business cards, that's a waste of time probably.
Yeah. I think you definitely have to like assess, the things you are doing. Cause even when you are experienced at this, you're kind of always reevaluating what's working for you and what's not. And
sure.
That allows you to kind of redirect your energy into better places once you realize what's working.
Right.
Yeah. That's a great, but I agree with you as well that like, social media, it can be beneficial when it's a great nurturing tool, like you mentioned. And, for getting your portfolio out there for a lot of people, especially if you have a circle of musician friends already, so not everyone's paying attention to what you're doing. So if you have something on social media that can show that, you know what you're doing and you're getting great results in your studio, then yeah, that's a way to get more people with their eyes on you. Right.
Right. Yep.
Awesome, man. Yeah, that's very cool. I think it's really important for people to hear that story of, having the first few years of the business or getting into freelancing being a little tough because it really is like that challenging period where it's like, how bad do you want this? And,
right.
Are you willing to make it work? And from the sounds of it, it sounded like were you still working at part-time at Starbucks when you started?
No. When I made that move, there was no, ever since 2003, there's never been any like, secondary, like side hustles or other jobs. It's been, strictly from production, mixing, back then even some, and then also some, writing royalties and things like that as well. But primarily production and mixing work, and some just coming in and doing, tracking for people, kind of one-off days, and maybe putting guitar on some people's records here and there in those early years. It was pretty much anything that, had a budget. I was like, yes, I'll do it. I didn't turn down much work back then. And I think that was, it allowed me to just, once again, by saying yes to everything, you're kind of helping a lot of different camps out at the time, and you're getting, better at a lot of different things, and you're starting to figure out what you love the most. And so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Now I'm more focused in being a bit more of a specialist, but back then it was kind of the complete opposite. It was more of a jack of all trades for sure.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things I was curious to ask you about, because I do know that you've worked on a lot of different styles of music. You've done the rock, bang, pop, EDM, jazz, soul, singer-songwriter, all that kind of stuff. But I do remember reading an interview that you did where you talked about how you were kind of niching down your services and trying to focus a little bit more on like some of the top 40 pop stuff, because that seems to be your wheelhouse. So yeah, I was curious to get your thoughts on, niching down and whether people should do that at the beginning or even at all. Some people never niche down, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question as to when you should do that or if you should. I think it's, different for everyone. Some people don't want to. Some people love every aspect. Some people love the production side of things and the mixing side of things, and they also want to master it. And maybe they're control freaks, or maybe it's just fun, or maybe it's just, because the budgets are low and they can't bring anyone else in. But then, some people also want to become specialists and just really get super, super great at one thing. And I think that's a good way to go as well. I've kind of been on both sides of that. For me, when I decided to just switch to mixing full time, it wasn't that I didn't enjoy the production side as well. I still have days where I really miss it. I love interacting with the artist and hiring session players and going to studios and trying things and different miking techniques and playing around with that, and a lot of more gear involved. And that's fun for me. It's just, I started to just I don't know. I think it's just over time, I've realized out of production and engineering and mixing has always been that one thing that I've loved more than the others. And I just decided, hey, I just want to do that every day because that's what I enjoy the most, and that's what I'm the best at, and I can add the most value by doing that. That's what more and more people are hiring me for. So it seems like that's what people want me to do. And then it gives you flexibility when it comes to maybe wanting to live somewhere different than a music hub. It gives you that remote option, less people kind of coming in and out of the house all the time. You work on your own hours. There's just a lot of benefits for me when it comes to mixing. My room is catered more to, it's more of a mix room. I don't actually have any booths here at the house, and never had a ton of pre's and a ton of mics to be able to do 24 inputs and all that. So it's kind of been a natural progression for me, and I couldn't be happier. This is kind of the first year where I think the beginning of this year was some of my last production gigs, and then the back half of this year has been strictly mix, and going into next year it's the same thing. And don't plan for that to change from here on out. So I'm just obsessed really now with becoming the very best mixer, and just every single day trying to get a little bit better than the day before.
I love that. Yeah, I love that you were able to identify the things that really you enjoy doing the most, and just doubling down on that. And I think you're right. It's like when you actually kind of eliminate all of those other things and you can focus on what you enjoy the most, it means that you're going to like work harder. Like you said, you want to be the best mixing engineer. So it's like, you're going to work harder. You're going to constantly be optimizing your systems and all that kind of stuff. And you can do that when you have a singular focus. But when you're like all over the place, it's hard to identify where you need to optimize, and actually then finding the time to experiment and try things. And
yeah. Yeah, and I also, in the production side, during production, I was just always entering in that engineer or mixer side of my head, and it would then the creative side would sometimes suffer. And I feel like, and I started thinking, there's so many people that all they want to do is produce, and they're really great at like that thing, even better than I'll ever be, on the production side of things. And so it made sense for me to, I think I got to a point where it's like, okay, I'm going to let them do that thing, and I'm going to do my thing, and it'll be the best of both worlds. So, yeah.
And I'm sure that's even provided some networking opportunities for you as well, or collaboration opportunities, because now you can, send people to other people and kind of create that circle of work for everyone, right?
Yeah, I've already this year passed on some production work to some other people, and it feels so good. It's kind of like, hiring session players. It's just so much fun to like kind of take a budget and put it into some people's pockets and let them pay their bills with it. That's really fun for me. And usually a lot of those projects now, I'm actually coming in on the front end and helping some with the tracking and then mixing all those projects still. So then I'm mixing the stuff that I'm tracking, which is my favorite scenario. So and then someone else has to deal with all the production headaches. So it's perfect for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Because then, in the end, you end up getting to work on better quality stuff and have a better experience with it. And you're not, pulling your hair out during the stuff that you don't really enjoy doing, and someone else can deal with it and do better, right?
Yeah, it's perfect. I love it.
Yeah, and I think but that in itself is a hard thing for a lot of people to grasp, because some people will look at others as competition instead of like collaborators,
yeah.
But I think everything you just said there proves that when you collaborate, there's actually more opportunities sometimes to do better things.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. There's plenty of work out there for everyone. Well,
absolutely.
I think so. I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but yeah, I think so.
But also, I mean, when you just take on everything for the sake of taking it all on, then you sometimes end up giving yourself a lot of work that you kind of don't want to get into, and like, let's say you take on a project for some genre of music that you absolutely hate or whatever, just to take on work. And then let's say that takes off, then do you want to be that person who then takes on all of that style of music from that point on?
Yeah. Known as the bluegrass producer or something. Yeah, no, I don't want that.
Yeah. Right on. Well, now that you're focused on the mixing side of things, I'd love to talk about your mixing process and to learn a little bit more about the work you do with that. So I'm curious to know, like, when you start a mix or when someone sends you files to mix, what is your mindset going into it? Where do you start? How do you start? That kind of thing.
Yeah, getting in their heads, the producers and the artists, especially their heads, is the very first step for me. I've learned the hard way over the years. I would just barely listen to the rough and just dive right in and go for it. And then that's not always the best, of course, to take, because you find out, they were really married to the rough and you just did your own thing. And it's, maybe it's cool, but it's not what they had gotten used to and what they're wanting. So for me, it's now more about just having a conversation, either through email or phone or text, just to go, okay, how close do we want to stick to the rough? Do we want to, like the rough only a little bit better? Or is it like, hey, just do your own thing. Whatever you think feels really good is good for us. And so asking some of those questions, making sure that if there are some references out there, what are those? And let me listen to those early on. Nothing worse than doing a mix and going, oh, no, actually, I want it to sound like such and such new single. And it's like, well, it would have been nice to have heard that before mixing the song. And so getting that kind of stuff out of the way, I'm actually even dabbling now with what I'm calling a mix survey. I don't know if this is a good or bad idea, but I built a form that I have off my website. It's kind of a hidden link that I can just send to clients, but it's just trying to, like I said, get in their heads before I start the mix. And if you want to submit this form, you can just put, your name and the title. And it's like, if there's a rough mix, I need the link to that. Are there any references? How close do we need to stick with the rough? Here are a bunch of adjectives, like click the ones that, describe what you're looking for, whether that's aggressive or dynamic or bright or dark or warm and so all of that information really helps me when I dive in to the mix. So that would be kind of phase one, just collecting as much information as I can from the artist and the producer. And then it would be listening carefully to the rough, making sure that I have all the same files that are in the rough, and if there are references, spending some time with those as well. Once all that's happened, we can kind of begin the mix prep side of things. And if I'm super busy, then Ben, my most recent intern, he will prep from his end and then send me everything back that's kind of been imported into my template with the markers and routing and all that taken care of. And then if I have enough time, then I sometimes just prep things myself. And then from there, it's just kind of starting the mix. And if you want to walk through kind of in what order that I usually work, we can do that as well.
Yeah, if you have a specific order that you usually follow, I'd love to learn that.
Yeah, so everything comes into the template, and I typically would start with like kick, snare kind of thing, and just get those hitting the mix bus, gain staging things and getting those hitting the mix bus properly. And then, from there, once that's kind of feeling good, start to introduce maybe more of the percussive elements and trying to get the vocal in as soon as possible. And yeah, it kind of depends on the song as to where I go from there. I think it would be drums and then maybe the primary chordal instrument, whether that's a piano or an acoustic guitar, and bring that in, get the bass and the vocal in. But yeah, every song is a little bit different for me. But yeah, I used to make the mistake of getting like an amazing sounding track together and then, okay, now it's time to bring the vocal in. And that was a bad idea. And I've just learned over the years that, you got to get that vocal in, sooner than later, just to make sure you make room for it. I mean, the lead vocal is the most important track of every mix that you do, in my opinion. So, yeah, I mean, it may not even be a bad idea to start with the vocal. And I've sometimes, if it's a very intimate song, it usually comes in pretty early on. But yeah, that's the typical approach that I would take.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think it is really important to get that vocal in early because, yeah, I'm much like you. I typically start working on the drums first, but I always try to get that vocal in early because it really can dictate a lot of your top end information.
Yeah,
sometimes
sure.
you get a singer that's got a really nasally voice or something that's really airy, and then it's like that's going to change how you treat your cymbals and all that stuff. So, or even how much attack you have on your snare or your kick or that kind of thing. So you do have to factor that in early.
Yeah, and the vocal, often dictates the type of space, the ambience of kind of how either wet this mix is going to be or how dry it's going to be. And so I think by having that and starting to figure out, how much either length or how just short and tight this vocal is kind of determines the length of other things and other elements as well. So yeah, I think it kind of tells you what you need to know, and so I think having that in as a guide is definitely a good thing.
Absolutely. You talked about how you're typically bringing these tracks into a template, and then you mentioned gain staging. What does the gain staging process look like for you? Like, are you trying to hit a certain number, or like, does that matter to you?
No, it doesn't. It's just a feel thing for me, and I think just doing it for years now, I don't really think about it that much. I used to have this auto gain plugin. I forget what it's even called, from this Italian plugin company, but and it worked well. But it was just one other step, and I don't know. It now what I do is I'm a big fan of the Softtube Console 1, the controller and the plugin. I use the SSL 9000J emulation on a lot of my tracks. So that's like kind of the first plugin in most of my inserts. And so that has just an input gain knob. And so lots of times it'll just be there or within the channel itself. And Cubase, which is what I'm primarily in, there's an input gain there as well, or I can clip gain it down. So it's just, something along the lines of that. Most of the stuff does have to get backed off a little bit just because it's coming in a little bit too much. But I'm not using like meters. I'm not, thinking about numbers. It's just a feel thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I find it fascinating with gain staging because there's so many different methods to it. Like some people are trying to hit a certain number or get it at 0 VU in their plugins or whatever. And then there's also people that will try to gain stage so that all of their faders stay at 0. And like, there's just so many different ways to do it. So yeah, it's interesting to hear your approach to it.
Yeah. I like to keep my faders, around 0, but it doesn't always work out that way. And then I'm trying to just hit, like I said, getting the drums to hit the mix bus in a way that it just feels really good, and I'm getting like the amount of compression limiting all that I'm wanting from that, and then start to bring other elements in from there, and it seems to usually feel pretty good by just doing that.
Gotcha. So would you say that you're gain staging to hit certain like you talked about, like compression, for example, like you'll gain stage to maybe hit like 3 dB of compression here or there or something like that? Or are you gain staging more to get kind of a rough balance to start?
Yeah, it's more of just to get a rough balance to start. Yeah, I'm not really thinking about as much about how it's coming into the next thing. Sometimes I'll make those adjustments if that's once I've already kind of diving into the mix. yeah, I don't know. I don't really think too much about it. It's just something that just instinctually happens for me. I try to be less like that these days, looking at less meters, working less visually, and just kind of being more of a gut ear thing. I don't know if that's good or not, but I like to think that, some of those classic records were made the same way.
Absolutely, for sure. And it obviously helps too if you have tracks that have been recorded at good levels and not everything like pinned to the top. If you're working with super hot tracks, yeah, you're gonna have to pull a lot more down. So
Yep.
it really depends on what's coming in, I'm sure.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So that's awesome. So you start with your, you get that vocal in, you start working on drums, you've got your gain staging set up. From there, do you kind of have a typical process that you go through with like applying additional processing, whether that's EQ, compression, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, and one other thing that kind of I didn't mention before is as far as just like how much time I would spend on things. In an ideal world, once I've gotten into their head and everything's been prepped, ideally that prepping happens on a day before I actually mix the song. That's my preferred way to work, and if the schedule allows, that's what I would like to do. So it gets prepped, and then when I pull it up first thing in the morning, everything's already routed in the template, ready to go. The markers are there, and roughly gain stage, whether I did that or Ben did that. And then I can just not be in that headspace when I'm starting a mix. So then from there, I would like to, to spend pretty much a full day, whether that's 6, or more hours. I feel like the average mix that I do, I spend 6 to 12 hours, a lot longer than some people do. But I'm a very detail-oriented person, and sometimes when you have 120 tracks, it just takes a while to sort through them all and get them where they need to go and figure out how to make it all work. But yeah, my ideal scenario was to prep the day before, mix a full day, and then the next day come back to it, first thing in the morning, fresh ears, fresh perspective. And if anything's, wrong, it will stick out right away. And you make those changes, maybe spend a few hours at the most that second day, and then send to the client, that first mix for review. So that's how I like to work in an ideal scenario. Sometimes too, or if it's like an EP or a LP, I'll sometimes kind of jump around and do 2 or 3 songs in a day and move around, and instead of just working on one song until it's completely done and then moving to the next. It just kind of depends on the mood that I'm in. But I sometimes enjoy jumping around just because every time I get away from something for a little while, like it's much easier to figure out what's still wrong with it when I come back to it. And so that speeds up the process in a way. I mean, lots of times with a mix, you can make some really big, bold moves in those first 2 hours, and then you spend 8 hours doing a bunch of minuscule things that like hardly make a difference, And so I like taking some time away, and then you can kind of come back and go, oh, and this is still like, that vocal's like 2 dB too hot. Wow, I had no idea because I got lost in all these other things along the way. So, so it just depends, like I said, on the project and what I'm, if I'm getting just bored of a mix or burnout on it or don't know what else to do, then that's usually a sign that I should jump over to something else for a little while. And working in the box is great for that. I mean, it takes like 45 seconds to open up a project file. And so, why not just jump around a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a couple things to take from that I think are really important. And one is that, you were talking about how you'll spend like 6 to 12 hours on a mix, and that is a lot of time for some people to work on a mix. And I think what is to your advantage there is the fact that you've done that preparation stage early. I think that's a really important lesson for people to learn from this, is that like having those kind of conversations with the band allows you to work confidently for 6 to 12 hours without fear of like, I'm in a completely wrong direction with this mix,
right?
Because otherwise, if you didn't have that conversation before, you could waste a day or two working on a track and then have the band tell you like, no, this is totally the wrong direction here, and then you got to start over, and you've lost all that time. So I do think that it's really important, like you said, to have that kind of prep stage of just having those conversations. They're simple conversations, like whether you're just doing it through a form like that, where like you're not even having a conversation with the band, they're just telling you exactly what they need. Like I think that's brilliant. Or if you're just spending like a half hour or 10 minutes on a phone call, like you can learn all you need to learn there, so that you're not wasting your time. So,
yeah, I think if you're only to ask one question, it's like, how close to the rough do you want this? I think that's the most important question. And then the second is probably, is there a reference you're really in love with and you want it to, tonally feel like this or whatever? I think that's another good thing. And that could just be a quick text, and that could save you a ton of time, because I unfortunately have spent a full day mixing something and then had to rethink the whole, when it's like, okay, this is nothing like the rough, and it's okay, I've got to really take this back and almost start from scratch to really get it to feel like the rough. So
yeah, absolutely.
And that's another thing that you got to make sure as well. You got to make sure you have all the files that are in that rough mix. And so sometimes it takes a little while just to do some listening, because if you've left out some key elements because you weren't paying attention, and then you send that first mix off, then it's just gonna, if something weird happens with that first mix, it's sometimes hard to like rein it back in and get back on track. They just feel like they get in their heads, and depending on the client. If it's a new client, it's can be challenging at times. If it's someone you've worked with for years, then it's not as big of a concern. But I think you really want to get that first mix right as you possibly can.
But that's interesting, because I agree with you. I think that there's a lot of artists that have listened to these rough mixes and they've got this case of demoitis where they're just so used to hearing it a certain way, right? But I'd love to actually dig into that a little bit too, because when you're listening to the rough mixes that people are sending you versus where you go with the mix, like what things matter to you in those rough mixes? Because some people would listen to those rough mixes and think like, I need to completely, get the frequency balance the exact same. And sometimes that's the biggest problem with those rough mixes. So there's like there's understanding what's in those rough mixes that is important and what's not, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. That may be another good question to ask. Like, okay, so you really want it to be close to the rough. Like, why do you love the rough? And maybe it's because I love the reverb on my vocal, and it's because, the drums are kind of like warm and dark, and it's because there's still like some dynamics there, or, the bass is really wide because we put chorus on it. I think those are all like great piece of information that, if you could get in advance, that would be good to know. But yeah, for me, I don't know. I guess I'm maybe breaking it down into instrument groups, and I'm thinking, okay, the vocal, feels like this to me. It's this loud in comparison to the music, or the drums, are real dry. Okay, I need to remember to make the drums dry. That guitar is panned to the right, so I need to make sure that guitar is still panned to the right. Those are, I guess, that's the kind of dissecting I'm doing, I think, when I'm listening to the rough more than anything else. It's just kind of taking all those pieces, or figuring out what all the pieces are and where they have them tonally, spatially, those kinds of things, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I also think too that a lot of these artists that are working out on their own, like they're not engineers in their own right. They may have a DAW, and so for a lot of people, like on the basic level, they understand things like volume. And so you can listen to the volume balances between things, because that's usually something that they've been able to figure out for themselves, that, they want the vocal a certain level or kick drum a certain level, whatever. So I think that's really important. I think panning is also a really important thing too. And obviously I do think effects are important as well, because anytime an artist is making that decision to add a reverb or delay or chorus or whatever, that is something that is beyond just the base level tracks. So, they've made an effort to go out of their way to include that in the rough. So most likely that's something that they want in your version as well.
Yeah.
I think it's just sometimes it's like those like really little minuscule things that people think that they need to keep in the rough mixes, that they need to keep in their final mix that was in the rough. And oftentimes the person making the rough didn't really even notice those things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I deal with demoitis a lot, and it can be frustrating at times to just put everything you got into a mix, and then it's like, it's really still super attached to the rough mix. Oh my gosh, okay, well then just release the rough mix, and maybe that's what it's going to take.
Yeah. So in your opinion, then, at the end of it all, like, what makes a great mix?
A great mix is a mix that really excites me, that I love, that I can't find anything that I don't like about it, that, the artist loves, most importantly, and that, creates an emotional response when someone listens to it. I think that's and I think that's probably the best definition I can give you. Yeah, where I'm happy, the artist is happy, producer's happy, everyone involved is super happy with it, and it also, does something to the listener when they hear it. Whether it makes them super, amped up, or makes them, think about some decision they just made in their lives or whatever. That's what a good mix is, and also just one that showcases, I think, the things that need to be showcased, and also pushes things back that don't need to, be showcased. I think that's also important as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You said something there that I want to push back on a little bit there, which was that you said, part of what makes a great mix for you is when you can't find any problems in the mix. And I know for a lot of people listening to this, that is their biggest problem, is that they're always finding problems. It's like, it's so easy to be super critical of your own work. So how do you get to that point where you're like, okay, like this is actually good, and like I'm not like where you're not just getting into this trap of finding problems for the sake of finding problems?
Yeah, it's not an answer. It's not the most ideal answer, but it's just experience. Is it just takes time, and you just got to wait it out, and you just got to do it over and over and over again, and you'll get to a place where you just know that it's right. I think you've heard so many other mixes before. You've done so many. You just know what a finished mix is, and I do remember in 2004, I think. There was like one mix I did 27 versions on, just myself. It was like before the client even heard it, because it was like I'd take it to the car and then listen somewhere else, and I'm like, oh, but maybe that's this, and then no, it's actually, and it was just this vicious cycle. And thankfully, now revisions are more of like just the client, the artist saying, this is what I want, and me making those changes. It's not as much about me just obsessing over every little thing. So yeah, it's not just something that, you can turn on with flick of a switch. It's experience is what it is. That's when I feel like, when it's done. I don't know if that's really what you're looking for, but
yeah.
That's what it seems like for me. I don't chase my tail like I used to.
Yeah. Because I know that a lot of people listening to this spend so much time on their mixes, just like they're never sure when they're done with it. And I feel like a lot of people have different opinions on when they're done with their mix, and maybe it's part of their process, maybe it's just something they're hearing, that kind of thing. But
yeah, I think sometimes it's maybe insecurity. One piece of advice I sometimes give people, it's like that just spend way too much time on a mix is just tell, before you even start the mix, like promise your client, on this day at this time, I'm delivering the first mix, and you have some type of deadline to work towards, because if not, you'll spend 4 times longer than you need to on the mix. And I've seen it happen a lot with interns that have kind of gone on to do their own thing, and just those first few years, I think just overthinking is what it is. Lots of times people will spend the first 6 or 8 hours, and the mix will be feeling great, and then they'll spend another 14 hours after that, and it'll start to fall apart slowly, over time after that 6 or whatever 8 hour point from where you initially started. And so by just going, okay, I've got the files from you today, I'm going to prep it this afternoon, I'm going to mix it tomorrow, and tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. you will have mix 1 from me. Creating some type of parameter, I think, is not a horrible idea, just to make sure that you don't overthink things. I mean, you may run into something and find out that you don't have all the files, or that something still needs to be edited and tuned or whatever. And those things might happen, but just setting a deadline is not a bad thing. I used to do that a lot with mastering as well. When I was producing, was like, okay, this record, we've been working on it way too long. Let's, 6 weeks out, let's set this mastering date now, so we have something to work towards. Because if not, you might spend another 3 months, messing with things, or people just pushing back their vocal sessions another week because they're not in the mood to cut vocals. And so I think you could do something similar as a mixer.
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's a great thing to do. And, even with those deadlines too, sometimes it's just a calibration point at that point, right? Where it's like you send off a mix to the artist, and you could even say to them, like, I don't even know if it's done, but like, here's where I'm at with it right now. Like, let's see what you think of it. And maybe you're on the mark, maybe you're not. And you can kind of reassess from that point. So yeah, I love that idea of working with deadlines. And it kind of reminds me of something that I saw recently on Instagram. You had posted, you made a post saying it was a post about how limitations can help foster creativity.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I was curious if, I think this kind of ties into it. I'd love for you to dive into that a little bit more and just kind of expand on that a little bit. Cause like, I'm curious to know, like, why do you think it is that when we place limitations on ourselves, it sometimes makes us work better?
Yeah. Well, I just think that when you have too many tools, you just get distracted. I mean, what inspired that caption was I was at this writing camp a couple weekends ago here in Nashville, and was just kind of there to hang out, network once again, build new relationships with other producers. And so I'm still networking 23 years in. So if you're looking to build relationships, this is another reminder that networking matters. So so I was there just offering to help track some vocals or whatever needed to be done on the engineering side of things, because there were probably 6 or 7 rooms, and somebody maybe putting down a beat. It was more of a R&B hip hop kind of vibe there. And so, I was just, tracking somebody playing Rhodes and tracking somebody cutting a vocal. And I didn't have my main computer. I was just on my laptop, and I just installed Cubase. So I didn't have all my plugins. I had just stock plugins and just somebody loaned me a 2-channel interface. And so there just wasn't much to work with. But I found that by not having all these things to fiddle with and plugins to audition, it made me focus maybe more on like the things that matter the most, I guess. If it's cutting a vocal, like it allowed me to think more about maybe the timing of the vocal, or was she pitchy here, or is that a good lyric, as opposed to, ooh, let me try to put some tremolo on this background vocal. And then all of a sudden you're not thinking about, once again, the melody, which is the most important thing. So I think that's kind of what I meant by that. It also, I found myself being more experimental, like, oh, I don't really know how to play a Rhodes, but I'm going to, run it through this and try to make something. And I was out of my comfort zone. I didn't have what I'm used to having. It just felt like, a different, I don't know, just went into a different part of my head for a second. And it was kind of nice. Cause I think when we work in the same room on the same monitors with the same plugins, we kind of just get into this cycle and have these habits that it's like, oh, I always put this on the vocal and I always do this with my drums. And all of a sudden you don't have those plugins anymore. And you're like, okay, well, I need to, do something different now. And it's like, oh, this is a cool plugin that I've never used before. And so that's kind of what inspired that post.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think limitations, there's so many different types of limitations you can place on yourself. And like you said, like in that example there, it was creating creativity and inspiring you. And a limitation can be stripping your plugins away. It could be having a deadline, but I think what the really big thing to take from that is that it forces you to focus on the big picture stuff. Like you said, that I think that's really what matters, is like, am I on the mark with this? And like, are my vocals sounding good? Is the mix sounding good? Like, if it is, then that's all that really matters. It's not about the plugins you're using and all that kind of stuff. And, if you're working with a deadline, it's like, am I taking care of all the most important elements of the mix before I get really micro and start nitpicking everything? So yeah, I do think that limitations are a really big thing to place on yourself. And yeah. Do you find yourself doing that often, like having these like self-imposed limitations?
Probably. That's kind of fits my personality. I'm trying to think of an example, a recent limitations example. Well, yeah, I mean, like, this may be an example. Like, I've found that the less that I solo things, the better the mix is going to be. So I've found myself now, like, this isn't really a limitation. I guess a limitation would be like hiding the solo button altogether, which might not be a bad idea, but just, creating these rules that I have to follow. And I've found that the less I solo, usually the more I like a mix, the less that I suck the life out of it. And so I don't know if that's a good example of
I love that. That's a great one.
I think that's like my mix tip of the month right now. That's the solo button is the enemy. I feel like often. I think the less that you can use the solo button, the better your mix is going to be, because if you solo every instrument and you know, are EQing it in solo, it just doesn't make any sense at all. You're going to find that you're sucking a ton of mid-range out of every little element. And then next thing you know, you've got this like smiley face, sounding EQ on your entire mix. And there's like no impact at all in the mid-range. So I think, you know, if you can create, for example, the limitation would be, I guess, find a way to hide the solo button in your DAW and see if you can do an entire mix without ever soloing a single instrument. I mean, if you really need to, I guess you'll have to pull the faders down on everything else or something along those lines. But it's not about how we're not mastering, you know, 67 multi-tracks. We are, you know, creating a stereo mix with those 67 things, and they all need to play well together. That's what a mix is. And so it's you've got to be thinking more about the interaction of this, like how does this vocal interact with the other, you know, however many other tracks there are, not how do I make it sound really great, you know, all by itself. No one's ever going to hear it like that. And so, yeah, that's a limitation that, like I said, I haven't hid the solo button yet, but the limitation for me now is just clicking it as few times as possible while I'm mixing right now. Hopefully that's a good example. It's hard to think of like something right off the top of my head.
No, I love that. That's a great one. Like I love with a lot of my coaching students, I always give them like little challenges like that kind of thing where, yeah, you know, you could say like, okay, you can't hit the solo button more than 10 times in the mix or something like that, you know, or like maybe it's, you know, when it comes to EQ, you can only use like a shelf filter or something like that, you know, like kind of just challenging people to really think in like these big moves right away rather than getting really micro.
Yeah. Another one would be, yeah, like you can only have like 3 inserts per track or something along the lines of that. I think it's really easy to over process as well. And so, yeah, I'm trying to be more minimal with the processing that I do. So that means how, like on my mix bus, how few plugins can I use to make that happen? And same with like my vocal chain. It used to just be way too many bands of EQ and too many different compressors and parallel this and parallel, and it was unnecessary. And so I think just simplifying is another limitation that I've kind of been chasing here the past year or two.
Yeah, I love that. I love that example of you know, limiting the number of plugins on a channel. I think that's a really big one, and I've certainly found myself in that trap at some point. You know, like I remember opening up some old mixes that I was really proud of, like my earliest mixes, and seeing like, oh, I just had like an EQ, like one channel, one insert on this, and that's all I did, right? Whereas like, you know, years into my career, I was like loading up, like you said, like having, you know, so many different plugins on my vocals, and it's like I was really overcomplicating all of this, you know. So it kind of forces you to like check back and simplify.
Another limitation would be no, you can't buy any plugins for the next year, you know, something along the lines of that, something that forces you to like really learn the ones that you do have, you know, because everyone has everything that they need in their DAW. And I don't know, I think a lot of people are chasing, they feel like their mixes aren't great because they don't have the new BB Tubes plugin or the whatever plugin, you know. It's like, you can, if you got whatever, you got Decapitator, make it work with that, you know. I don't know. I think a lot of people just think that they can throw hundreds of dollars at plugins all the time to make their work better. And I think it's the more important thing is just really getting familiar with the things that you do have. Maybe find that one EQ that you love, that you know really well, and use that most of the time. And same with, you know, a couple compressors and a couple verbs and that's all you need, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's so easy for people to get caught up in this marketing hype that you need this plugin to get a pro sound or whatever. And it's like, no, you probably already have like 5 things in your plugin list that are exactly the same. You just have to learn how to use it, you know? So.
Yeah. And you'd probably be better off spending that money treating your room a little bit better, or upgrading your monitors, or, you know, something along the lines of that. I think that might make a bigger difference than getting, you know, a 5th saturation plugin.
Yeah, of course. Well, everyone listening to this, I think we just threw out a bunch of great limitations to place on yourself. And, you know, I think everyone should be experimenting with these things, whether it is limiting their plugins or, you know, giving yourself a deadline or a time limit, or, you know, reducing the number of times you hit the solo button, that kind of thing. I think these are all really good exercises to strengthen your skills. And, you know, maybe don't do it on like a mix where it's like super important, but like find the time to just practice and implement these kind of things. And I think when you actually do that, you'll see really fast growth in your skills because of it. So yeah, man, I love those. I love those limitations you said. I think those are all great examples. So yeah, thanks for sharing
Good.
those, man.
Yeah, that's where my head's at the moment.
Yeah, well, good place to be then.
Yep.
And I'm sure you're seeing your template optimizing as you go through these examples too, right? And like just getting probably thinner and thinner.
Yeah, every mix that I do, I learn something new, and it's something that either the technique that I implement, or it's a revision that I make to my template. It's like, oh, that's better than any other verb I've ever used before. Or whatever, okay, let's get rid of something in the template and replace it with this, or yeah. So I'm always discovering new things, and that's the beauty with the template is it's something that over the years you've defined your sound, and you're just kind of fine tuning it along the way. And there are certain, plugins that do come out every once in a while. It's like, okay, that does make a difference after demoing it. And it makes, going from for example, like a Waves, maybe a L1 limiter to something like the, Fab Filter, Pro L2. That to me was a plugin that was justifiable, just because it's such a big part of the mix bus, and I think it was worth it. But then, like I said, there's some things that I don't know if you need another plate reverb if you already have two others. So, yeah. But anyhow, I'm kind of going off track now.
No, it's great, man. I love it. I think that's probably a great spot to wrap up, because we've given people something actionable to do. And, I think that's what this is all about. It's like people listening to this are trying to find things to do to help improve their mixes. And I think, giving them these little challenges here, I think that's a great place for people to start and to learn a lot from. So, maybe we should start to wrap up here. But for people who want to learn more about you, maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I've had a website for a long time. That's brenthendrich.com, HENDRICH. Instagram is where I spend most of my time, and that's just at Brent Hendrich. So yeah, please follow me and let's keep in touch. On Instagram, I share, 3 or 4 posts every week and a reel every couple weeks with a mix tip. And just, share things that I'm learning along the way. So it's a good way to keep up with me and what I'm doing there. If you are in Nashville, either live in Nashville or visit Nashville, I have a group that meets once a month called Summing Mixer, and that's just a kind of a hangover coffee at a coffee shop here in town. It's the last Tuesday of every month. So if you're ever in Nashville on the last Tuesday, hit me up and I'll get you all the details. I just buy coffee and have a table reserved, and we just talk about, whatever, plugins or difficult clients or, whatever's on our mind that month. So that's a good way to hang out in person. And yeah, I guess that's about it. I'm doing a thing now too. I didn't really discuss this in our conversation, but I'm also doing a thing now called Mix Assist. So any producer who is working on trying to mix something themselves, and they feel like they just can't get it to where they want it to go, then I'm offering 3 free 3-hour sessions a month that you can schedule online. And that link is actually off of my Instagram. I have a link tree, and it's one of the links off of my link tree. So if you're working on a mix and you need some extra help to kind of get it across the finish line, then you could book one of those 3 sessions a month with me. And I can do that either remotely, where I tie into your DAW, or if you're in Nashville, you can bring some files over here. I actually did one earlier today. So it's just been a great way to kind of see what other people are working on and help them get it, their projects to sound a little bit better. And just, once again, it's kind of another form of networking, really, and just all about building new relationships with people, especially the people working on the kind of music that I want to be involved with.
That's awesome, man. I love it. Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I think you shared a lot of great stuff here. So people are going to learn a lot from this for sure. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad that I was able to share a little bit of that.
So that was my conversation with Brent Hendrich, and that was awesome. I really enjoyed the exercises that he shared towards the end of the episode there for ways that you can place limitations on yourself to strengthen your engineering skills And I highly recommend that you actually try these things out for yourself. Take some time to open up an old mix, maybe start from scratch and just place some limitations on yourself. And I think that it'll be a very therapeutic exercise for you. And this is definitely something that I've done with myself. Like I've definitely placed limitations on the types of EQ filters that I can use. I've placed like really crazy deadlines, like a 30-minute mix or that kind of thing. Sometimes the results of these limitations aren't necessarily going to mean that you get the most perfect mix, but it's more about just working from a big picture point of view and learning to work more efficiently and streamline your process. And sometimes when you place these restrictions, it forces you to think differently. And sometimes from that exercise, you learn more efficient ways to work faster or smarter or get better results with less tools. So, by going through these exercises, I think you're going to learn a lot, and it's going to be a great challenge for you, and it will certainly strengthen your skills. So definitely make sure to give that a shot in your mixes and just take the time to practice this stuff and impose these limitations on yourself frequently, because the more you do this, the faster and better you're going to get, and the more experience and instinctive you're going to get with your skills. So definitely give that a shot. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you got a lot out of it. If you did and you're new to the podcast, definitely make sure to subscribe to it. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're looking for tips on how to improve your mixes and get them sounding as good as you hear them in your head, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. That is a website where I help out musicians with creating pro-sounding mixes from their home studios. And on that site, I've got a ton of great resources designed to make it easy for you. And one that I want to point you to is a book called The Mixing Mindset. That is a book where I break down the process of mixing step by step, showing you what to listen for, how to dial in the settings, what tools to use, all of that stuff, so that it takes the guesswork out of the process and makes it super, super simple and gives you a beginning to end formula to follow when it comes to your mixes. So once again, make sure to check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and that's available at MasterYourMix.com. All right, we've reached the end of the episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.